we will be recording this afternoon's discussion. Secondly, I'm going to ask Harriet to introduce some of our stakeholders. Now, what I would usually do is invite the stakeholders to maybe speak for 5 minutes, but we've actually got quite a number of stakeholders present. So if it's okay, what we'll do is we'll just introduce all the stakeholders, or Harriet will do that, and then I'll turn to each of you if you want to either make a point or ask a question, really just to get the discussion underway. And as is usual now with these virtual meetings, if I could ask those who are not speaking just to mute their microphones. So without any further ado, Harriet, could I invite you to introduce some of the principal stakeholders?
Yes, of course. Yeah, thank you everyone for coming today. So to start off, from the University of Plymouth, we have Professor Richard Thompson, and from the University of Newcastle, we have Dr. Priscilla Carrillo-Barragan. From the University of Glasgow, we have Dr. Natalie Weldon. From Xeros Technology Group, we have Christian Colleen, who is the Commercial Director, and Xeros is a UK-based laundry technology company which has developed microfiber filtration technology for washing machines. From the British Retail Consortium, we have Sustainability Policy Advisor, Leah Riley-Brown. From Surfers Against Sewage, we have both Amy Slack and Henry Swithenbank. From the Marine Conservation Society, we have Dr. Laura Foster, who is Head of Clean Seas. From the Microfiber Consortium, we have Sophie Mayfair, who is Executive Director, and the Microfiber Consortium works to facilitate the development of practical solutions for the textile industry to minimise fibre fragmentation to the environment. From PlanetCare, we have Moha Zupan, who is the CEO. PlanetCare has developed a range of innovative filtering solutions that effectively stop microfiber emissions from washing of clothes. From Keep Britain Tidy, we have Richard McLuhan, who is the Deputy CEO. And from Cora and Rozalia Project, we have Rachel Miller, who is the founder. And from Friends of the Earth, we have Camilla Zare. So hopefully that's everybody. Please let me know if I missed anybody out.
Thank you, Harriet. And of course, we've got my parliamentary colleagues, both in the House of Commons as well as some members of the House of Lords who have taken an interest in this. So good afternoon to you all. I'm going to kickstart proceedings, actually, as is the prerogative of the chair. And I'm going to be entirely selfish, if I may indulge for a moment, because I'm a graduate of the University of Glasgow. And so I'm very pleased to see Dr. Natalie Weldon on from the University of Glasgow. And I'm going to actually ask you, Natalie, first, if you'd just like to tell us a little bit about the research that you're doing and the sorts of issues that you think we should be looking at as parliamentarians and those interested in this particular area.
Thank you so much, Alberto, and to everybody here, it's great to be here with you all. Yeah, at the University of Glasgow, we are working on observing microplastics of all kinds in the environment, but our particular focus is around our various industries in the marine sphere and increasingly in the terrestrial realm that may be affected by plastic pollution. So my own background in this area comes from looking at the uptake of microplastics, which are predominantly microfibers in my own work in organisms that are targeted by our fisheries, for example, or are an important source of revenue for aquaculture. And we're increasingly looking at farming environments as well, because getting up is incredibly difficult if you want to spend lots of time on fishing vessels. It's far too early. You get a lie-in if you want to work with agriculture instead. One of the things that we are incredibly proud of with our work at Glasgow is working alongside organisations such as BICO, Archelec and Inheriting Earth in looking at solutions to the microfiber issue, including things like looking at textile-sourced microfibers. So one of the things that I think is incredibly important to understand is, particularly with looking at microfibers from the home, is that our wastewater treatment already does an incredible job in extracting a lot of these, but where we should be focusing, in my opinion, humble though it is, in areas of looking at what we can do to reduce the amount of microplastics that get to that point, and appropriately handling the amount of microplastics that are released from the plant either through the water systems or, more importantly, as sewage sludge as well. So looking at those areas and seeing where we can work together to find solutions. And that's me.
Thank you very much, Natalie. In fact, I'd come across some of the work that you're doing in the university's Avenue magazine, which is the magazine for graduates. So I was most impressed that Harriet had already picked up on the research that you did. But clearly we've got academics from different establishments across the UK, and I'd like to turn to Professor Richard Thompson, whom I've met and I've had the opportunity of talking about this. Perhaps, Richard, you can tell us a few things about the research that you've been doing and what you might like to achieve through this parliamentary group.
Well, thank you very much, Alberto. I mean, we've been working on plastics in the environment, or I have, for about a quarter of a century. It was a paper by my team in Plymouth that were the first to use the term microplastics, and we've been working on accumulation in the environment and impacts, as well as looking at solutions. And I agree, we find a lot of fibers. You know, we find them in the deep sea, we find them in Arctic sea ice, we find them in the fish in the English Channel. They're certainly incredibly prevalent. I think there may be other forms of microplastics that are harder to spot in environmental samples, things like tire particles, for example. But, you know, it's very clear that textile fibers are incredibly abundant. And so I think we need to work to see what we can do to try to reduce this largely unnecessary form of microplastic contamination. I would say that, you know, there's sort of three approaches. You could try to screen them out in wastewater treatment, but then the challenge is, what do you do with the resultant sludge? In many places, that solid sludge is returned to the land as a kind of fertilizer. So whilst you caught the fibers in the first place, you're then putting them back in the environment. And of course, you know, there are lots of places worldwide that are not connected to sewage systems at the level that we have in the UK. There are devices to fit in washing machines, but still you've got the question of whether every consumer will use those and use them properly, and what do you do with the fibers? And then, you know, finally, working back to the design stage, some of our work has shown that there's up to a 5-fold difference between identical looking garments bought from the same shop in terms of the rate of microfiber shedding during laundry. So to me, the key opportunity is to make sure we're looking at the design stage to see if we can minimize fiber loss there. It's not to say that wastewater treatment isn't part of the picture, and it's not to say that filters aren't part of the picture. But if we could reduce those emissions by 80% through smarter design, that would not only make our clothes last longer and be more sustainable from the fashion context, it would also considerably reduce the rates of microfiber emission. And yet there's very little work on that topic. I see more investment from UK research and innovation in wastewater treatment, and I see more industrial investment in devices for washing machines than I do the textile fibers. And I, you know, if I'm honest, I sense a slight reluctance from some of those organizations to engage with the topic. And that's, in my view, where we need to put pressure. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. And that again, that's an area where I was wholly unaware of the concept of tackling it at source rather than filtration systems, or at downstream, rather upstream, tackling the production of clothing, etc. Could I turn to our next academic, who's Dr. Priscilla Carillo Barragan from the University of Newcastle, who's also involved in this as a research associate at the Dove Marine Laboratory. Priscilla.
Thank you very much for inviting me. I'm really, I cannot believe it. It's very important to have this type of conversation. But so we're a new group in the microplastic discourse. Actually, we had the support by Professor Richard Thompson, and so it's very nice. Right now, we're just monitoring as well. We have a dove time series, which is a zooplankton collection since the 860s, something like that. So I'm counting, essentially that, counting microplastics, how it has been increasing. I have observed mostly microfibers, mostly PET, what we see on bottles. Yeah, plastic bottles are made of that. And yeah, the thing is, we have now many evidence of the accumulation of plastics, of microfibers. And what I think is very important and what we would like to move forward is to have more, we need ecotoxicology evidence. Okay, we can stop, we can design for better, as Professor Thompson has said, and we can try to stop it before it gets to the ocean. But the fact is that there is already a soup, there's already a plastic soup. What do we do with that? Are we scared of that or not? So I think there's a lack of evidence for the impact that this is already having, how bad it is, what is the effect of each different type of plastic, how it is being accumulated, is it being biodegraded, is it not, what are the products from this biodegradation or just degradation overall. I think that's important. I also think it's important that we have standards for that, that we measure the discharges from wastewater treatment plants, like we measure E. coli and other maybe hazardous substances. We don't have that, but we first need to know if these are dangerous, to know if we actually need to measure. So I think this, although there's a lot of work going on microplastics, I think we still need evidence for the hazard of them, of the different types of plastics, and then set up some standards for that. And we think, for example, zooplankton could be a good way to monitor, because they reproduce very fast, and you can have a big sample size for that. And we already have standards for how to collect zooplankton from the ocean. It was set up just to inform fisheries of what is the amount of fish you will get, what is the amount of this or that, or what is the health of the oceans. But it's also very laborious. So this is just the type of work we're doing. And yeah, so my message is, I think we need more ecotoxicology work, more evidence of the hazard of the substance, and then set up standards. Once we know what is dangerous, start measuring, because you cannot control what you don't measure. And that's it. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Priscilla. And I should say there is the chat function, or if you want to ask a question at this point. If not, I'll just carry on going through the list of colleagues that have joined this afternoon. We've got the first of our commercial directors here, who is Mr. Christian Colleen from Xerox Technology Group. Perhaps you could tell us a little bit about your company, Christian, and the good work that it does in trying to minimise exposure in the environment of microplastics.
Good afternoon. Thank you very much indeed for the invitation. This is a really important initiative, and it's great to see the leadership in this area. Xerox Technology Group are actually a water-saving company as our key technology, and that's the main thing that we work to. But we've a number of years ago recognised the issue of microplastic pollution and started to develop a solution, which we've done, which is a product called X-Filtra. Unlike some of the other solutions available, X-Filtra is designed to be incorporated into the design of a washing machine. We believe that is technically the most effective, and also doesn't pass on disproportionate cost to the consumer, because, you know, to the point that Professor Thompson very rightly made, we need compliance from consumers in order to be able to make a difference. And at Xerox, we really strongly believe that any standards, any regulation that's put in place really needs to matter in terms of an environmental outcome. We also believe that this is an area that we focused on. Filtration is an area that we focused on, but that is not the entire answer to this, and a holistic approach is absolutely required with both short-term, medium-term and long-term solutions, and we think there's a part to play in all of that. We were very cheered to see the X-Filtra went through the recent study from the University of Plymouth and performed extremely well in that, and we're engaged with stakeholders, manufacturers across the industry to look to implement our solution into those machines. But from a Xerox point of view, this is one of two things that we do. We're about water saving and the environmental impact from that, but also now about microfiber pollution and minimizing that in terms of the impact on our seas and oceans. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Christian, for that. In fact, I've got a number of questions that arise, but I'll hold on to them until we go round everyone.
Please.
Next, we've got Lee Riley-Brown from British Retail Consortium, and Lee is a sustainability policy advisor. The consortium, of course, engages with retailers, non-governmental organisations and academics to better understand this issue. So, Lee, over to you.
Thank you. Yes, and thank you for having me. I think we are in the presence of some very eminent and very respectable academics and other organizations. And I think my biggest role in representing, around 5,000 retailers, a lot of fashion retailers and supermarkets who sell clothing is we need to listen to the science on this. And there's a lot of work going on, but there's still a lot of work that we need to wait for as well. BRC, we are a firm supporter of the Microfibre Consortium, so I'm glad, Sophie, that you're here, because we need a standardized test method as well that's applicable for the whole retail industry, for manufacturing, because it doesn't make sense to sort of chase a piece of string, if you pardon the pun, if you don't know how long it is. So I think, we are, as an industry group, we are still waiting on that, because we need to level the playing field and make sure that everybody's operating on the same level. I think for consumer products as well, at the sort of post, at the domestic washing end, again, that's not a silver bullet, because as was rightly noted earlier, there's a lot of pre-consumer shedding that happens as well. And sort of wet treatments throughout the whole of the processing. So, very much echoing Christian, what he just said is it's a holistic approach, and we need to sort of find these hot spots all the way through the life cycle of the clothing. So my role as sort of industry retail representative is, again, to sort of bring together the science, the academics, with some of the potential solutions. But also to speak to government, to MPs and the like, to say, we need to wait for as much information as possible before making a huge commitment in terms of policy. So I very much welcome this APPG, because I think you're doing exactly that.
Thank you very much, Lee. And again, I've got a number of questions that arise from those welcome comments, which we can come back to. Next, I've got Amy Slack and Henry Swithenbank from Surfers Against Sewage. Amy, perhaps you can tell us a little bit about Surfers Against Sewage and what you would like to achieve.
Yeah, thanks for the invite, Alberto, and to welcome the Women's Institute in providing Secretariat support for this APPG. Surfers Against Sewage, we've been in existence for about 30 years now. We primarily started as an organisation focused on water quality, but over the last 10 years have been quite active in the plastic pollution sphere. So we mobilise hundreds of thousands of volunteers to take part in beach cleans and evidence-based research at a citizen science level across the beaches in the UK throughout the year. We collect evidence and data on the extent and scale of the plastic pollution problem that we're facing, mostly on a macro plastics scale, but also on we do a bit of research on the micro side. Laura and Richard do a similar kind of have a similar kind of role in their organisations too. We're in terms of the sources, it's interesting to think about the sources of where these microplastics are coming from when we're thinking about solutions to tackle them. Obviously, we've got sort of, as I think, Natalie, you maybe referred to, road and tyre wear sources, paints, anti-foul on boats, also textiles, which a number of people have mentioned. And really the thing that we need to remember is that we can't just sort of clean up the problem. It's very, very expensive. It's very, very difficult to do, and particularly when we're talking about microplastics are very, very hard to see. And we need to really think about the waste hierarchy when we're talking about microplastics and how we're going to reduce microplastics in the environment in the first place. So, you know, in terms of kind of what we see the problem to be, you know, a number of people have talked about the sort of the wastewater industry and preventing this material getting out into the environment, which is obviously a key aspect. But as a number of people have rightly highlighted, we capture this stuff in wastewater treatment, and then we apply them back in the land, and they often just end back into our waterways, our rivers and our seas, through surface water runoff, etc., and through the drainage systems. So it's not necessarily a solution. And I think what we need to really start thinking about, which a number of people have come up with on this call, is around sort of the redesign principles, the reduction principles, and how can we really create policy that enables those changes to be made in the system, full stop. So it's a really interesting APPG to be part of. I think there's some really interesting people on this call that could really start to think quite creatively about policy mechanisms that can be put in place to really tackle the issue of microplastics, which is going to be a massive issue in terms of emerging threats in our environment, and how these microplastics are kind of routes for transmission of disease, invasive species. Of course, microplastics are transboundary as well, so must remember that at all points as well. Henry, did you want to add anything quickly before I...
Just to say very quickly, we obviously represent water users kind of up and down the country, and we're still very aware that the effects of microplastics on human health are not quite understood yet, but we think that where there may be risks to human health, it's best to take the precautionary principle as well, to kind of protect water users up and down the country.
Thank you, Amy and Henry, for that interesting oversight of your organisation and the types of issues that you both think we need to give thought to. That's very helpful indeed. Can I move to Dr. Laura Foster, who is Head of Clean Seas with the Marine Conservation Society? Laura.
Yeah, thank you for the introduction. So the Marine Conservation Society is particularly at the moment focusing on the issue around microfibers. And we sort of strongly believe, you know, that we should be stopping this at source. You know, that a number of people have sort of mentioned the wastewater sort of capture rate, you know, being sort of 98, 99%, but also that is then gone into sludge. And obviously sludge is a potentially a viable good product that farmers use. So we need to be looking much further up the system and really looking at focusing at starting the pollution at source. So when we look at that, there's we see it as two potential intervention points. One is looking at kind of the textile industry, and the other one is by fitting sort of filters onto washing machines. We believe that the textile industry has an important role to kind of play in terms of what it actually does and, you know, its impact. But there is a number of kind of questions about sort of those intervention points when it comes to textile industry, such as, you know, if you're looking at reducing microfiber loss, if you apply chemicals, for instance, then you potentially have a chemical pollution on top of a microfiber. So you may delay the release of the microfibers, but you don't prohibit those microfibers being released. If we come and look at some of the kind of textile, different kind of weaves, I imagine that, you know, or well, I do know that certain types of weaves are better than others, for example, but we need to make sure that, you know, we are clear on what are the sort of controls on that, and therefore we need to have a kind of publicly available test methodology that is peer reviewed. It's available to academics and researchers, as well as sort of organisations such as myself, and then we're able to sort of go, here is a transparency, and I think that's really important. However, what I would say about that is, you know, and I'm sure I know there's some people with a lot more textile experience than myself, you know, that is still to sort of come out of, pardon the pun, the wash. You know, there's still some work to be done in terms of getting that, but we definitely want to push for that transparency. As the Marine Conservation Society at the moment, we're particularly focusing on the washing machine filters, and there's a number of reasons for that. Even if we had the perfect textile tomorrow, people are still going to own those clothes. They're still going to be washing those clothes.
you know, in reality, we might have a reduction in the amount of microfibers that are lost. You know, we improve the textiles, but they're still going to be lost, and therefore it's very important that actually we continue to capture that. And the third thing is really that it's a technology that's available now. You know, the research is out there. There's an understanding of the kind of capture rates that can be achieved. And, you know, I particularly welcome the comments about precautionary principle. What we need to think about is that microfibers, particularly sort of microplastics, are persistent pollutants. The longer that we wait, the more that they're going to build up and build up. So, you know, there is obviously some discussion about what levels does it become toxic, etc. What levels does it have an impact? What we don't want to be doing is sitting here in sort of 10 years time going, well, we've now reached that threshold, and then we've got absolutely no way of removing that. So we should be putting interventions in now when we're able to do those, and obviously as others come online we should be doing that. And I think to facilitate that, we really need to see the development of a PAS standard for the washing machine filters, so that it can be agreed upon, so the engineers can get going on their job, so they understand what the specifications is that they're doing. And that would help to sort of make sure that the UK is leading kind of this push in terms of microfibers. And, you know, we know that the technology will come through. It's already in discussion in France, where there's legislation that will come through in 2024. That's already on the statute books, just to be clear. So, you know, we will see European washing machine manufacturers forced to do this. So, you know, it would be good to get the UK really ahead on this programme. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Laura, for that, and for reminding us that France is pushing ahead with this particular legislative change. If I could invite now Sophie Mather, who's Executive Director with the Microfiber Consortium. Sophie.
Hi there, thank you very much for the opportunity to speak today and to join the forum. Great forum to be part of. I suppose my first observation is I feel a little bit like the odd one out today, because I'm kind of directly representing the brands and retailers and the impact change we can actually make with regards to product, both at the consumer level but also at the manufacturing level, and that's really what TMC is all about. So I think my first call to action really to the group is, can we invite some other people like myself to kind of balance out that really deep academic research that we've got in the forum, together with the enablers that will enable us to kind of make that product change, because I feel a little bit on my own on this one, and I really would kind of benefit from some support there. The other things to touch on, I think some really good points brought up by all the speakers so far. On Natalie's point, stopping at source, yes, that's what we're about here at TMC. So to give you an example, I think Leah already told you about the test method that we developed in the early stages. That has been key and monumental through the core of our work. But the second piece of work is to really support the brands and retailers with kind of designing product differently. So that kind of design engineering, where we can actually inform them to better practices with regards to textiles. We have, I would say, I think we're the only standalone organisation that is 100% dedicated to this topic, and we all come from a very strong textile background, both from academia, from manufacturing, and from brands and retailers. So I think that's really important that we bring in that credible kind of expertise in the textile area. One of the key things that we've done is we're in the early stages of releasing a database to our members, where we're actually pulling in testing data underpinned by very detailed fabric and yarn specifications, and that combined information will enable us to inform change at the brand, retailer and supplier level. Last time I checked, I think last week, we had about 230 different materials and yarns in that database. So to Richard's point earlier, when he said, you know, fivefold difference between identical garments, yes, what we're finding is a lot of people can see on the outside what looks like identical garments, but within this database we can get the next level of detail. And because we are very geeky on textile science, we understand, you know, how's the twist of that particular yarn impacted it, or how's the particular finishing, etc. So it's all really exciting that we can actually marry all that information together to give concrete information back to the industry. And that is something that has been seen very favourable by EU when they're developing policy. So we also support the European policy development, and they're very keen to get their hands on our database. So that's what we're doing there. And then the final part is on the manufacturing level is, you know, through our brands and retailers. So we have about 50 members now. the core of them brands and retailers, all with their own supply base that we can tap into. But we also have supplier research members, so the facilities across the globe that we can work very closely with to understand what's happening at the manufacturing level and implement change there. So I think Laura made a great point about filtration and things like that that can happen during manufacture, but we're getting down to the next level. And actually my colleagues are in that meeting at the moment while I'm here, but really looking at, you know, what we can do in addition to filtration, because there's a lot of other things. And we're starting to get an understanding of where loss is coming at all the different stages of production. So great forum to be part of. I'd love to bring some friends into the next one and help you out on that kind of initiating product change. So thank you.
Thank you very much, Sophie. And Fiona and Harry are certainly noting the comments that you've made about who we might invite for future meetings. Could I turn to, forgive me if I'm mispronouncing your name, but Professor Andrej Krizan, who is of PlanetCare. Professor, perhaps you would like to outline what PlanetCare does and how it might help in this area.
Thank you very much. First, I have to say I'm extremely happy and honored to be part of this meeting. And I appreciate what is happening, particularly what the Women's Initiative is putting together, because they were active already several years ago. I remember we had our meeting in London. PlanetCare is a startup, and we are fully focused on preventing microfiber pollution. We see the washing machine and the washing process as a source, not a cause, and we think this is a convenient choke point where to stop the fibers. And I agree very much with what the other speakers said. I think we should look at this in a holistic way, so that we should look at how the textile can be changed, what we can stop from the washing process, and then further down at the wastewater treatment plant. And we are somehow lucky that we have a part or a type of microplastic pollution that we know where it's coming from for the most part, and we can actually control it if we try. And I agree very much with what Richard said. This is a preventable type of microplastic pollution, and I think we should stick with that, really. At PlanetCare, we started from where Xeros was talking about, that it's really the most logical thing to insert filters into washing machines. But you know, a few years ago, there was really a lot of opposition. So what we did, you know, nobody wants to own this problem, really. And that's what you mentioned as well in the introduction, that there isn't interest in some parts, or I think Richard mentioned that. Richard did, yes. Mentioned that there's not a lot of interest in some parts because there's a fear that whoever will show interest then owns the problem. And that's not really the case. They can actually contribute to a solution to the problem, really. So we went from this initial point of going into the machines, we went on to a add-on retrofit filter that early adopters can use, and we have several hundred users now around Europe, but also many in the UK. And I have to say, the UK is one of the leading countries in awareness of this problem, and also being very active, which is evident from today's discussion. We started with that, but of course we also have a solution that goes into the washing machine. We have a high capacity solution for laundries, for example, and also we had a foray into the industrial part. So I'm very happy to see a lot of people that we've already spoken with in the past. Maybe I would like to emphasize something that Ms. Foster mentioned. We can discuss a lot, and I'm an academic. I'm one of those rare people that came from academia. I'm a researcher, and I joined actually a startup to work on a solution, not just to study and talk about it, but really find a solution. Because when working with students, my feeling was, well, if I can filter it in the lab, why can't we do it in real life? And Ms. Foster made a point. We can't wait. We have to move, and we have to move quickly. And there is actually no reason why not to move, really. Even if I've always said, even if we stop 50% of the fibers, that's much, much, much better than zero, and then start with something slightly better 5 or 10 years down the line. So I think that's where we should look. And you started with a question initially to, I think, the first speaker. What do you expect from joining this forum? And let me just answer that very briefly. To contribute toward a solution to stop the microfiber pollution, we'd like to contribute. I think it's coming from the whole discussion. There's enough for everyone to do, and we need more and more partners. And partnering is something that we're good at. We like to network and partner. And looking, let's say, at what could be done, we know what's happened in France. We were a proof of concept, actually, for the French movement on that, on the legislation they passed. And we're very proud of that. But for example, maybe something like extended producer responsibility could be a point of discussion, and we could have voluntary or regulatory interventions. And I think that's what we should discuss on top of what was mentioned, and the science, which is a necessary background, and the transparency that has to be also there. And maybe I'll finish here. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Andrej, for your contribution. I've now got, is it Rachel? Yes, Rachel Miller, who's the founder of the Rozalia project, and that is involving the Cora ball, which many of us have come across, Cora ball and the Rozalia project. Rachel.
Yes, thank you. Thank you very much for having this meeting and for including me and us here. We really appreciate it. So yeah, so you're familiar with the Cora ball and that work, and there's so much I have to say that so much of what I have to say echoes what we've heard before. So I want to just spend a moment with something a little bit new. So we have been working on microfiber pollution from the beginning as it relates to washing machines, and that's where the Cora ball came in. You guys are familiar with that. Just last month, we published a study looking at dryer emissions, and the fact that electric clothes dryers that are vented to the outside are directly contributing microfiber to the environment. And it's early in the big picture for us looking at dryers. There's not a ton out there. There have been some studies, but there's less overall dryer use. In the US, it's around 80% of households. In the UK, as of 2 years ago, it was about 58%, as we could see, and growing globally with this sort of, as more people move into the middle class. And it's something that is of concern and part of this conversation because of the fact that it is direct emissions. There is no wastewater treatment plant to get in the middle. And I will drop the paper link in the chat. It's open access. So what I'd like to sort of advocate for as we look forward at this is continued support of multiple strategies, to echo what we've heard before, and to say that to encourage practices that are immediately available right now. So things like the Cora ball, but also even best practices like what the Women's Institute has been sharing, just to wash clothes less, that kind of a thing, doesn't cost anything. To encourage the development of in-line washing machine filters, and then to add looking at dryers and innovations as it relates not to both the lint traps in dryers and also the vents, both for condensing dryers, which would be really interesting to look at. We didn't look at that in our study, but we looked at the air venting kind. And to continue to support and cheer on the great work that Sophie's group is doing to understand what's happening with textiles, to develop that incredible database, and to make the clothes that we're wearing more resilient, whether we're washing them, we're drying them, or we're wearing them. So we appreciate, again, the opportunity to be here, and I will drop the dryer study in there and happy to talk to anyone about that.
Thank you very much, Rachel. I was slightly alarmed when you said just wash clothes less. I'm a father of 2 young children, and I'm just wondering, how does one get round that, particularly a 7-year-old boy who's perpetually coming in with dirty clothes. But certainly one to think of as a consumer as to how we mitigate against the pollution that we create. Now, I think I've covered everyone. Forgive me, is there anyone that I've missed out that would... Yeah, sorry, Richard McElwain, forgive me. Richard, if you would like to introduce yourself and say a few words, forgive me.
Yeah, hi, no problem, thanks for that. Richard McElwain for Keep Britain Tidy. Really interesting on the washing point. I think I heard the chief executive of Levi saying he never washes his jeans. He just puts them in the freezer. I assume he does if he gets tomato sauce down the front of them, but in any other instance, he doesn't wash them. So that is definitely a thing. So we've been active for a number of years on our own in collaboration with others on the issue of litter and waste, and obviously now plastics, which is a component part of that. And we have a big role to play in controlling macroplastics, which obviously are themselves a contributor to secondary microplastics. Also, a big agenda at the moment on cigarette litter. Of course, tobacco filters themselves contributing to microfibers, and something we're very keen to try and sort out. We're actively at the moment sort of researching the microfiber issue with regard to textiles, because I think, as Laura touched on, there's a whole range of different sources of microplastics and microfibers, from tire wear to washing to a whole range of other sources. And we are very alive to the fact that, you know, the fashion industry, should we call it that, is sort of responsible in some ways for the fibers, you know, that are ultimately generated when you get the right way back upstream. Some of the things that we're actively looking at are, how do you really get right upstream of this particular issue to the sort of to the materials that we actually choose in the first place. There's a lot of talk around capturing microfibers, which particularly microplastic fibers, which are shed from synthetic materials, principally polyester, nylon, acrylic, when actually there's a whole range of different fibers, bast fibers that are out there, hemp, nettle, all sorts of different things, which are different to cotton in terms of their, in terms of having better environmental impacts, less water use, less pesticide use. And, if we were to focus on the choice of material in the first instance, we might start to make some changes right at the upstream side of this. So that's one point. The second point is, I think what this group needs to be looking at a hierarchy. A bit like the most sustainable mobile phone you could have is the one you've already got. The most sustainable clothing you have are the ones that are actually in your wardrobe already. And of course, we do have an industry that's predicated on fast fashion and delivering more and more clothing every year. So actually, how do we inspire reuse? How do we inspire repair? And then if we are encouraging people to buy new, how do we encourage them to buy the right materials and then look after them with low temperature washing and so on? And it was good to hear the extended producer responsibility discussed just then. France, which obviously, as Laura said, have legislated for filters by 2025, and washing machines also, I think, still have the only EPR, extended producer responsibility scheme for textiles globally. And it is one of the approaches we should look at. We should be looking at eco-design. We should be looking at extended producer responsibility as a way of encouraging manufacturers right at the beginning of the process, of the design process, to influence the choices that they make and the ease with which their materials can be repaired, particularly when I think RAP's own figures suggest that we still dump 350,000 tonnes of textiles in landfill every year. We should be recovering that, and we should be recycling it, and then we don't have to worry about grabbing virgin materials because we've got a lot more in the system. So I guess that's where KBT's thinking is going at the moment. And again, like others, very, very, it's great to be part of this group. The other point I'd make is there is an APPG, I think, on fashion, sustainable fashion, and clearly making a link between the work of this group and the work of that group, I think, would be a good move at some point in the near future. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Richard. Is there anyone else before I invite comments? No. In that case...
Alberto, sorry, you missed out Camilla from Friends of the Earth.
Where's Camilla? Oh, sorry, Camilla, I didn't see yes. Camilla, forgive me. Over to you, Camilla. Camilla's there.
No, hi everyone. I'm Camilla from Friends of the Earth. Thanks for inviting me to talk. I'll be honest and straight with you. I'm actually quite new to the sort of plastics area, and I've just started as the plastics campaigner at Friends of the Earth, and I'm really here to sort of listen in and hear what all you guys have to say, because this is the kind of thing that we do want to move forwards on with Friends of the Earth. So we're really working on parliamentary solutions at the moment, sort of thinking about the Environment Bill and how plastic pollution targets could be part of the Environment Bill. So that's what I'm focusing on, and obviously microplastics and microfibers are part of what we want to see be reduced. So basically, thank you for all your help and intelligence that's being shared here, and I'll be keen to listen in and to find some solutions with you guys. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Camilla, for that contribution. Look, one of the reasons of having this group is really it provides a forum for you, the various stakeholders involved in this field, just another platform to share your views, to share your opinions and thoughts on the best way forward. And for folk like me, as a parliamentarian, to learn about this issue and to encourage my colleagues in Parliament to take on board the questions which you raise and potentially the solutions that you propose. The word solution has been mentioned a number of times. There seems to be a developing view that the solution doesn't just lie at the removal of the microfibers that have been generated through, for example, washing machine filters, but also at source, whether it's at design stage. I think as a politician, my own view is that yes, we all have a role in society to alter our behaviour, and politicians certainly have a principal role in doing that, primarily through legislation, guidance and rules that come out of Parliament. But by altering our behaviour, it doesn't mean going back in time to a position where we, for example, wash clothes less. The reason we wash clothes is primarily one of hygiene. We've improved in hygiene over the last 50 to 80 years, and certainly I can't see as a father, as I mentioned, how I would be able to go back and not clean my son's clothes as often. What concerns me is how can I ensure I mitigate against damage to the environment by ensuring that the clothes that my son wears in the first instance are minimising any damage that they might do to the environment, or perhaps require less cleaning. Perhaps the threads are made in such a way, the cloth is made in such a way that dirt doesn't adhere to it as much as perhaps other cloth. But consumers, in order to attract consumers on board, I think we need to ensure that we're not turning back the clock. Let me give you a simple example. And the simple example is what we've seen in terms of lighting in our homes. Up to 10 years ago, the only way of minimising energy consumption was to buy what was called, they still sell them as energy-saving light bulbs, which weren't quite the same as filament light bulbs. They never gave you the same brightness, the same warmth. They didn't last as long, and they were pretty costly. But there's been a revolution, a silent revolution in the lighting industry, where LED lights have taken over from filament. I mean, filament bulbs were inefficient. They produced heat which was wasted. And now we see in most homes the use of LED lights. We still got some of the more halogen lights which generate a lot of waste energy as well, but LED lights has been a silent revolution, different type of lighting, much more efficient in terms of use of electricity, and that's what I would like to see us go forward in terms of microplastics. How do we mitigate against microplastics in the first place without necessarily changing the conveniences that we have in modern society, whether it's buying inexpensive clothes for fashion purposes, or whether it's driving cars that generate wastage through the rubber that and the other synthetic materials that are used to build tires. It's getting to a point, I think, where we minimise that pollution but still have the benefits of modern society. And that's where the challenge is. Now, I think for washing machine filters, given that France is moving there, is potentially a step in the right direction. It doesn't come across as a particularly costly solution. It doesn't cover every aspect of microfibers. And as Richard has reminded us on the online chat, the fibers that are generated from synthetic clothing, just by wearing them, may be as impactful negatively on the environment as washing these fibers. But nevertheless, it's a start. And again, I compare the start of plastic bags. Plastic bags of themselves are not the primary cause of plastic waste in our society, but they're iconic. They're a symbol of plastic waste. And that's why politicians like me took the step of ensuring that we now charge for plastic bag usage and consumption. And we've seen an enormous drop in plastic bag consumption, but that hasn't necessarily equated to an enormous drop in plastic wastage. But it's been a symbol, nevertheless, a symbol in modern society that we've got to start moving in the right direction when it comes to our plastic consumption and waste. So that's just some of my own thoughts. I'm happy to open it up to the floor if anyone's got any questions they would like to ask of others. Yes, I see the first hand is Natalie, followed by Christian and Sophie. If I can take it in that order, Natalie, Christian and Sophie.
Less of a question and more of a comeback, I'm afraid, Alberto. I will have to say, particularly with a link to what the Women's Institute have been doing regarding awareness around microfiber creation and formation. Now, I'm guessing that you, as a parent dealing with children's clothes, know that something is dirty when it bends. Usually when it's gotten to that point, and that's the point at which you wash. Whereas a large proportion of the population, it's dirty once you've worn it once. And that's a very, very different set of fish. And what we can be doing, particularly in that area, is encouraging more sustainable washing practices rather than just saying, you know what, if it bends, well, maybe it's got a few more days in it. So, and within that, obviously, plastic is a pollution that is unlike a great many other pollutants out there. It's not a DDT in that there is one or a couple of solutions to this issue, and it is in many cases going to be chipping around the corners and making those small increments and changes. And I think that there is a wealth of information in the room that can attack that. So I don't think that changing behaviours is something to be neglected or to be sidelined at this point. And I think that there's fantastic work going on out there with people like, crikey, what's their name? It's gonna, obviously the Women's Institute have been working with their members, but there's also a lot of different organisations out there that are trying to raise awareness of how we manage our clothes and how we manage that interaction regarding washing and the plastics that it creates. So I'm going to advocate for behavioural change here.
Thank you, Natalie. Christian.
Thank you very much. Really interesting points and great perspectives expressed. I think, to go back to the original point, and I think that echoes certainly something that Professor Thompson mentioned right at the start. We do need a holistic approach, and I represent a commercial organisation, and obviously we have a commercial interest, and that shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. But microplastics from laundry, and whether you want to get into greater levels of detail in terms of their contribution to this issue, is about 35% of the primary microplastics going into the ocean. There are solutions available today that could be implemented as early as next year if manufacturers wanted to actually do that, and many manufacturers are engaging on solutions to do exactly that. So we feel, and certainly our part of the debate here, is this is an area where you can really cut deeply into this problem very, very early, and actually give yourself that buffer to be able to develop alternative solutions, to be able to develop solutions to be able to manufacture yarn and textiles in a way that minimises shedding. I completely hear the issues around other sources of microplastics, and the fact that you wear microplastics sheds them, whereas that is undoubtedly a valuable consideration. I wouldn't necessarily translate that as an excuse not to do things about microplastics coming from laundry. It's a very big problem, so therefore we're going to ignore all the small aspects of it. Doesn't feel like a particularly logical response. I think one of the things I would probably point out as well is this distinction between microplastics and microfibers. And microplastics is a huge area. However, I certainly believe that synthetic clothes are here to stay. Just from the basis of population growth, synthetic clothes are here to stay. So we have to address this problem in one respect or another. But microfibers is equally as a problem, but one that's more technically difficult to deal with. And certainly part of our research at Xeros has been addressing the much smaller micron rates that you get from microfibers in comparison to the rates that come off microplastics from synthetics. They are different, but they have an absolute impact and an absolute.
Christian, I think we may have lost you. I'm sure Christian will reconnect. I'll move to Sophie. Sophie.
Great, thank you very much. Just something going back a little bit, actually. I wanted to address the terminology part. I sit in many forums here and across European policy conversations, the same in the US, etc. Everybody seems to be moving away from the term microfiber. And I will give you some reasons why. Microfiber is a very, very specific technical term that's used in our industry, and we're finding that it's starting to alienate a lot of people by using that term, because it's misunderstood, it's misrepresented, and people don't want to come to this forum because they are not producers of microfiber. And we know that this issue is not just about what we put in, it's how something comes out of a textile, so it's the actual size that's coming out. So the change is moving more in Europe and America to using the terminology fiber fragmentation, which is much more specific to this issue. And also what that also means is, to Rachel's point about the work on air emissions and potential air pollution, as we start to look outside of just water-based pollution and we start to get into air, the actual majority of the problematic fibers in that situation are going to be cellulosics and natural fibers. So if we use the term microfiber, which is, determines the synthetic fiber, we're alienating quite a large part of this. So as a group, is this something that we can, start to align with the other forums? Because I think that would help us out. And then I know we don't sit in Europe, well, but I think it's really important that we need to align with our European counterparts and our US counterparts. So that's the first part. And the second part on the washing machine and kind of what we can actually do there, consumer habits. There is a lot of research out at the moment. So I think even before we get as far as having to make any sort of investment, some sort of consumer education about quicker, fuller washes, things like that, that have been found to make, quite big, significant difference, and that's without anybody having to make any investment. So I think it's bringing those stakeholders into this forum, and again, I'm happy to make some recommendations, but I think they could bring some real value into this for a very quick turn solution.
Thank you very much, Sophie. Who else would like to make some further comment? We've got Henry. Henry.
Great, thank you. This is more of a question that's kind of directed to all those politicians in the room, but what are the kind of policy changes that you think we would need in order to drive action on this issue? I think it's been talked a little bit around extended producer responsibility, which we know will come in through the Environment Bill, but also a question whether you think there's scope for targets and setting targets in the Environment Bill to reduce plastic and microplastics.
Thank you. I'll come back. I'll answer that question in a moment, Henry. I think Laura had her hand up as well. Laura? Nope.
Yeah, thanks. Sorry, it was just a delay in unmuting. Yeah, I mean, I think, as everyone rightly points out, we need to do there are multiple actions in this. I think what I'd like to also emphasize is I think, we need to see transparency, and we also need to see kind of system kind of change in terms of, I've talked about the microfiber filters for washing machines. We need to have a kind of a standard that manufacturers can work to. If we're talking about textiles, and there was a question that I posed to Sophie on the chat, and I won't sort of reiterate her answer or misrepresent it, but you know, we need that kind of transparency in terms of exactly what is it that's going on in the kind of tests, so that you know, we're able to kind of roll it out, because you know, consumers aren't aware of what's happening. I think you know, it's very commendable that you know, some of the retailers are sort of getting on board and sort of saying, okay, we're going to test our product. But I think you know, that's sort of very much kind of going behind closed doors, and I can understand that there are commercial reasons for that, but I think at least if there's some kind of engagement and transparency, I think that that would really help you know, consumers be able to make informed choices. Because at the moment, as Richard pointed out, you know, you could go and buy 2 t-shirts, they probably look identical, but actually you know, they do the same function, but actually you've no idea which of those 2 is kind of having that kind of greater loss. And I think you know, we have to understand you know, what is that loss. And also you know, I raised it sort of in the previous thing, but I think it's really important that we don't see what I describe as kind of gaming the system in inverted commas. I'm not quite sure how to otherwise describe it, but effectively, you know, if you're adding chemicals, you potentially dampen that microfiber loss, and effectively you're postponing the problem. You know, you might get a few extra washes before that microfibers is lost, but then you've kind of got a double whammy of a problem. So, you know, we really want that kind of transparency. We want to understand, you know, what is companies doing it. We don't want to just see them say, oh well, we'll bung a load of chemicals on top of that and then we get a good rating at the end of that. You know, that will be detrimental to what we're trying to achieve. So I think those calls for kind of standards, that everybody understands what they're measuring to, and then understand, you know, what is it being applied and when it's being applied, will help provide and make sure that it's kind of robust and fair as well, across the industry.
Thank you. And I think Andrej wanted to come in as well.
Thank you very much. I just would like to make 3 points. One is actually that we need to support awareness. All of us, I think all the stakeholders, we need to work on making the society really aware, the consumers aware, and not in a sort of way saying that we will all die tomorrow, which we won't, hopefully, and not from microplastics certainly, but still that it is a serious challenge. And why it is a serious challenge is something that hasn't been really mentioned throughout the whole discussion. I know everybody knows this, but I think it has to be said. Once we release the microplastics into the environment and into our oceans, we have absolutely no method, no solutions, and not even an idea how to actually get them back in. This is something that's gone out and then it's there. And this is a serious issue, because that's the alternative to us not doing what we should be doing. And just back to the awareness point, I mean, I normally ask people, you know, would they be okay with eating fish or seafood that contains plastic? And I haven't yet found anybody saying that that's okay with them. But a question also maybe to you, Alberto, is how can we help? What can we do, and how can we help the process so that we move in the right direction? And I think that's probably one of the things that we should you know, think of.
Thank you, Andrej. Well, if I can just make a few points, having listened to a number of stakeholders. So Henry asked, and Andrej is asking as well, what can we do to encourage policymakers and members of legislatures to make various changes that are required? I think certainly for me as a politician, as a parliamentarian, whenever I look at legislation that has an economic impact, I ask myself whether that economic impact is sustainable, whether in changing the law or amending the law, whether the loss of a particular industry or a section of an industry, jobs in other words, is offset by the creation of new opportunities elsewhere. So for example, if we're talking about changing people's behaviour and getting them to reduce the amount of washing that they currently do, my initial thoughts, and forgive the sort of naivety of it, but my initial thoughts are less washing means less use of a washing machine. Less use of a washing machine means less use of washing powders, washing liquids, etc. And there's a huge industry devoted, as we know through the various adverts that we're constantly bombarded with, in that sector alone. So if we use less washing materials, does that impact negatively on that industry? If there's going to be job losses, where are those offset? Where would we see new jobs created? Similarly, less using of washing machine, less use means less wear and tear, which means that you extend the life of a particular model of a washing machine, which means that you spend less money on buying to replace. And that impacts on gross domestic product. So these are the sorts of questions that policymakers and legislators ask themselves in passing a law, in amending a law which seeks to solve a particular problem. What other problem economically might that create in our society? And so I throw this back to you, the stakeholders. I'm particularly keen on, for example, looking at, I call it upstream. It's simply, you know, at the stage of design and production, because if we move away from problem threads, problem textiles, but we still, we replace them with textiles and with threads which do not cause pollution, we aren't necessarily losing industry. We're merely creating opportunities in a sister industry. And I think that sort of option to policymakers is much more attractive than simply the dead hand of legislation to ban this or to ban that. So that's my initial basic thoughts on what might attract policymakers and members of various legislatures to consider the economic impact that measures might have. Natalie, I see that your hand's up. I'm happy to come back to you, Natalie, in the first instance, and then to Richard Thompson.
Oh, Richard's been waiting a lot longer than me, I do have to say. So
in that case, I'm happy to go to Richard then first. Forgive me, Richard, and then we'll come back to Natalie.
Thanks, Natalie. It didn't matter. We go. So there's a couple of points. I mean, first of all, Alberto, I'd hope that there is a wider view on sustainable use of the world's resources and the circular economy than the one you seem to have just articulated. I mean, the main challenge here is that we've got a rapidly growing human population, and we are going to need to do more with less. There are problems associated with pumping out tons and tons of washing powders. There are problems associated with making washing machines that don't last very long and need renewing. You know, we need to work much more in the spirit of a circular economy. Of course, we need jobs, and I think that's your underlying point there. But I think, you know, we have to accept that we're going to need to do more with less and get things to last longer. You've got to think about this in a more holistic way. Then the point I'm really wanting to make here is that the environmental science that I think is missing from a policy, and I think if there's any way you can nudge this towards the research councils, we need more evidence about how to make informed decisions between different options. You know, in this case, wastewater treatment, filters, textile designs. We don't have any pieces of work that glue all of those things together. And you could say the same thing of recyclable bottles or refillable bags or whatever it might be. We know there's a problem, but we're lacking environmental science to guide the solutions. And I think it's really important that we have that so that industry and policy are making informed choices. In the longer term, we do need a way to help industry to be more precautionary. Otherwise, we're going to keep hitting these problems. You know, the reason we've got the plastic challenge, you know, in 1950, we made 5 million tons of plastic globally. It was mainly convenience things like packaging, but it was a drop in the ocean, the waste that was produced. Today, we're producing 360 million tons of plastic globally. 40% of it is single use. We can't sustain that waste because of the growth in plastics and the population associated with it. So we need to start thinking from the design stage if we're going to have an economy that's also fit for the environmental sustainability of the planet. And so that's a longer term aspiration. I don't know how we achieve that, but in the short term, we desperately need information to guide decisions because, you know, I'm not sure that banning drinking straws is going to fit the problem. You alluded to it earlier with the iconic carrier bag. I'm in support of that legislation, but as you say, on its own, it's not going to fix it. So we really need to know how to trade off between solutions, where to get the best bang for our buck.
Thank you, Richard. Natalie.
I feel like I'm just going to build on what Richard was saying there and potentially come back partially to what Sophie mentioned earlier in the discussion of potentially different fibres and good and bad textiles, and touch briefly on textile design in relation to the industry and purchasability as well. So the focus on alternative fibres. A lot of the time within this issue, people tend to focus on alternative fibres to mean natural fibres. Now, there is increasing evidence that we are finding lots of natural fibres in the environment along with our synthetic textile fibres. It may be that they're having similar effects whilst they are breaking down at a faster rate, but also in that transition, if you're looking at checks and balances, you've also got to look at cost benefits of things like land use for production, the water that's associated with processing a lot of these fibres, etc. And while I absolutely appreciate what my colleagues here have said about sustainable design and useful design, it's how far we can take that design process before we come up with a garment that is either unwearable or not purchasable. And I think that there will be a lot of designers looking at their markets in this case. That is not to say that it is something that should not be focused on. It's potentially something that needs more focus as a result to tread that very fine line between sustainability and profitability, which brings these organisations along with us.
Thank you, Natalie. Sophie, I wonder if you want to come back on I've noticed the comments you've made on the chat thread. I wonder if you've got any comments that you would like to add.
Oh gosh, where do I stop really? No, I think everybody's making really valuable points. I think one thing I do want to say though, the textile industry is terribly complex. I'm not trying to make it difficult. I'm not trying to delay the conversation or getting us to actions. But I think an understanding of, you know, the speed at which we're working is because it is really complicated to get to all the different levels. What I would like to see happen is, you know, our part in this. You know, I don't know anything necessarily about impact to fish or impact to human health. What I do know is how we can actually change textiles, and that's the bit that we're going to do as well as we possibly can. I think, you know, what everybody's saying about, you know, starting with design as one way of doing it. I think the database that we've created is a really good starting point for that. We are a membership-based organisation. We have not had any public funding to date. I think if we could get the right funding, we could actually be that bridge between really rich, very good academic research and the ability for industry to make change. I'm not going to tell you what our turnover is, but it is not enough to scale that database to the level that we actually need. So this is just really a call for action that we need funds to be able to take our work to the next level. We've got the groundwork, we've got the expertise, we've got the contacts in industry. We are just too small to do what I'm hearing people need us to do, really. So sorry, I know that was a bit of a plug for money, but I think that's really what it has to come down to.
Well, thank you, Sophie. And, you know, there's nothing wrong in asking for more money. You're not the first, and you certainly won't be the last to. Richard, I want to just come back for a moment on a comment you've put up on the chat line, and it's further to a comment that Natalie made about natural fibres. And again, you know, the understanding that many policy makers have is that natural fibres, because they biodegrade quicker over time, that they have less of a negative impact on the environment. But am I mistaken in that general view that many people in my position hold? In which case, is this group looking perhaps at the wrong thing? And go back to Sophie's point about fibre fragmentation, rather than calling the matter microplastic fibres. What would you say to that, Richard, about the difference between synthetic fibres and natural fibres in terms of what's causing an issue?
So I think the point here are a range of different issues. You know, there are an immense range of sustainability issues associated with the production of cotton, for example. I absolutely don't think it's as simple as synthetic fibers bad, natural fibers good. What we need is evidence to actually guide us a little bit more. It's clear we've got end of life problems with the synthetic fibers. There are probably also production problems, but we need to weigh both sides of that up in order to get the best. I mean, it certainly isn't the case that, broadening it a minute, you know, all plastics are bad. Plastics can help to reduce our environmental footprint on the planet. And actually they could do that without these unwanted side effects of the accumulation of waste.
Can you just tell us sorry, Richard, can you just explain to me how is it that microfibers can have a beneficial impact on the environment in terms of reducing the impact that other fibers might make?
Well, if you think of the substitution effects, by, let's say, comparing the sustainability issues, the land use, the habitat destruction associated with growing crops in agriculture and the water that's needed to grow those crops in order to produce cotton, for example, compared to, let's say, synthetic fibers. So there's a big environmental footprint on the production of some natural fibers, and we need to consider that. We need to consider things in the round. There's also issues, I would say, because, you know, with any garment, it needs to be durable, it needs to last. And you know, you're kind of saying, which is true, that the natural fibers will probably degrade more quickly, but at the same time, we know we're finding a lot of fibers that are semi-synthetic in origin, things like rayon, which have been converted from wood pulp. We're finding those very persistent in the deep sea, in the Arctic, and yet some of the producers would say, well, surely we'd expect it to degrade. And I think, you know, there's a challenge here, and it's broader than just the textiles. It's very difficult to have any garment or any plastic bottle or carrier bag or whatever it might be and expect it to do its life in service, to last, to bring you service over a number of years in the heat, in the sun, in the rain, in the cold, whatever, and then somehow the minute it becomes waste to magically disappear. So I think we'd be oversimplifying it to say, you know, natural fibers good, synthetic fibers bad. I certainly wouldn't propose the answer to this is abandoning synthetic fibers and some of the benefits that they bring. So we need to think about it in the round. It makes it challenging. It makes it what some would describe as a wicked problem, but it isn't impossible. We can do that, but we need to look at it through a lens, I would say, from different perspectives. You very rightly have highlighted the economic issues, and although I, you know, a bit critical a minute ago, absolutely recognize those. We need to bring the economists, the polymer scientists, physical scientists, the environmental scientists, and the social scientists that can help to nudge behavior together to look at some of these challenges. And it's not, I don't think we're ever going to come up with an answer that A is the best way to do it. I think what we're likely to come up with is A, B, and C, you know, whether it's fibers or plastic bottles, are appropriate. They're relatively good solutions compared, let's say, to X, Y, or Z. But that's the level of the science that we need to understand for particular applications and even in particular contexts, because, you know, the solutions in a country like the UK, where we've got relatively good, sophisticated waste management infrastructure and relatively good wastewater treatment, might not be the same in a developing nation. So we need to consider this in the round from a number of different perspectives in order to reach appropriate, optimal solutions, but it isn't a black or white, this versus the other.
Thank you, Richard. I noticed that Rachel has her hand up, and that's followed by Laura as well. So Rachel followed by Laura.
Thank you. Yeah, I wanted to echo that and just say, so with the Cora ball, we designed that as what we call equal opportunity fiber catcher. We are not, neither Rozalia project nor Cora ball are anti-plastic clothing. We too see a need for synthetics, and we see some persistence in the naturally based fibers. And so sort of 2 points there. We've done now 2 expeditions on the Hudson River, sampling for microplastics from the mountains to the sea. And both times cotton has been somewhere near the 50% of the fibers we've found in the wild compared to polyester and other. Now, the thing is, I don't think that the population along the Hudson River is wearing 50% clothing. I don't think our textiles that are being worn is that's representative. So it does indicate, and these are scientific questions that need to be answered. It does indicate that there's some persistence happening in cotton fibers in the water that may be unexpected, that there may be some assumptions people are making about the degradability of natural fibers. So that's something, that part. And then the last is, from all the information I've seen, I don't think we can feed and clothe the world on our agriculture, especially as populations grow. And with that in mind, we must have smart, resilient, synthetic clothing that can live in a circular world.
Thank you, Rachel. I'm going to invite Laura and then Christian, and then I think we'll have to draw our discussion to a conclusion. So if I can invite Laura followed by Christian, please.
Thank you. I'll keep my point short because we're running out of time. But just to sort of follow on, you know, Sophie was talking about sort of financial input, and I should caveat by saying this is definitely no criticism of what Microfiber Consortium is doing. But if you look at kind of the amount of money and profits that the textile industry generate, you know, the call for 1 pence per garment to be applied could then be, you know, done to kind of provide transparency for a database and then research, and then regardless of the size, effectively they would pay in proportional to the size of the company. And I think that's really important. You know, if Sophie's feeling that, you know, she's not getting the funds to support it, then, you know, I think there's a real sort of need for the legislation to kind of come in and sort of say, actually, we should be doing this. If we want to solve this and we want to do it in a transparent, open manner, then we should be supporting it. And, you know, I think the 1 pence per garment has been on the table for a while. So, you know, I think that's definitely worth something to revisit and looking at how that money could support things like this.
Thank you, Laura. And Christian.
Thank you, and I'll try and stay online this time. I think it's great that there's been so much debate and discussion around this, what is undoubtedly an incredibly complicated and complex issue, and one where there's obviously great scope to additional research and additional understanding of the problem and how that translates to solutions. I would say, though, that this problem has got worse since we started this call. And there is a piece about, you know, action sooner rather than later, in a sense that we can take some action, recognizing that this is not going to be a silver bullet. There's not going to be an instant resolution to this problem. That this is going to take time. So, you know, we would be very supportive and very keen that, you know, this is seen as a journey and we take initial actions, and then we can move into research and take follow-on actions as appropriate to really address this problem head on and take some global leadership on this point as well.
Thank you. Before I summarise and draw matters to a conclusion, is there anyone that hasn't spoken, or there's one last comment that they would like to make? That's yes, Natalie. Okay.
Sorry, I always hate the person that butts in with that one last comment. However, I think one of the key things that we all have to consider when having a look at these different approaches that we can take is what is measurable in the long term in terms of the impact that we can have. If we want to do something that is particularly policy driven, we're going to need to have outputs and different points at which we can check the usefulness of the different measures that we're making. That's not to say that there isn't space for a whole suite of different interventions, but it's identifying places like during water treatment sampling, during the manufacturing process where a certain proportion of fibre is lost, different points at which we can measure how well we're doing, set ourselves achievable targets, so that when we report back to the public, when we decide that we are going to set, I don't know, maybe punitive measures on different organisations, we have something that we can hold up as a measure of best practice or good quality that we can use. And I will leave everyone there. Thank you so much.
Well, thank you very much. I think this has been a really interesting conversation. I can see that each of you as stakeholders in this particular area have got your own views on whether you think issues should be tackled primarily or principally in the creation of the textiles and cloths, or some of you much keener on tackling the issue that we have now, perhaps through water filtration systems in perhaps domestic washing machines. I also note that there's one or two of you that agree that even the terminology might not be appropriate. I think it was Sophie that said that we should consider calling it fibre fragmentation. I must confess that was a new phrase to me rather than microfibre. This is a big topic by its very nature, but look, as a parliamentarian, I'm keen on trying to help and ensure that we, of course, any decision, any consideration that we have, any thoughts that we have are based obviously on the science, but it is a developing area and it's a science that we still know comparatively little about, given that plastics have really had mass consumption for only 50 to 70 years. But we do have, on the other hand, we do have academics like some of you who have been looking at this area very closely and have already opined on where you think and consider problems to lie. I think it would be useful, and I don't know what you'd think, if we set up a WhatsApp group to initially include you as participants in this call, that could perhaps be administered by Harriet and Fiona at the Women's Institute, with the view to helping guide me principally on where you would like to take this all-party group. Because ultimately the discussion that I welcome that we're having has to lead to a concrete proposal based on science that I can then present to my colleagues in government and say, look, this is potentially an avenue that we could go down. On the one hand, I'm minded to consider more seriously the washing machine filters, if only because France has made that decision. France would have made that decision based on science as well. They wouldn't just be pulling out a policy out of thin air and legislating for it. So I'm keen on perhaps pursuing that avenue, at least as a starter, given France's move in that direction, and wonder whether you'd be agreeable to maybe having some focus in that area without negating some of the other points that we've discussed. Would you agree to at least start focusing perhaps on that area whilst looking still in the round on this issue? Can I have some thumbs up if that's what you think, so at least I get a view? Okay, so there is some consensus there for that. So why don't we at least start thinking on that line, but at the same time, if you could feed in the views that you have in perhaps our WhatsApp group. I'm also mindful of Sophie's point that we should invite stakeholders that can further assist. And I think, Sophie, as I say, that Harriet and Fiona will have taken that on board. And perhaps you can maybe give some guidance to Harriet and Fiona on other stakeholders that you think might be appropriate to invite. We did have at the outset of this call, one of my parliamentary colleagues, Mark Posey, who is an adjacent MP. He is the MP for Rugby. I'm South Leicestershire. And one of the reasons that he came on is he's got a rather large plastic packaging manufacturer in his constituency. So he's very keen, obviously, in ensuring that we hear from all sides on this topic. And I think it is very important that we hear from, as I mentioned earlier, about the importance of balancing any request, any ask, versus the impact on the economy. That has to be taken into consideration. And I take on board Richard's points about the circular economy. But the easiest thing I can do as an MP is to put down a proposal that is either cost neutral or that has a, if it has a negative impact on one industry, there is a very clear opportunity for another industry. So again, I'd like you to think with that in mind. That's one of the ways that we can help answering Henry's question about how do you persuade people that make the law. That's one of the primary ways of persuading it, by saying that there are other economic opportunities if you take this particular path. So thank you very much for taking part this afternoon. It's been a very useful session. I look forward to having more of these sessions with you and with the ultimate objective of improving on this particular field. But can I take this opportunity once again to thank each of you for taking part this afternoon, Fiona from the Women's Institute for hosting this, and Harriet from my team for putting together the logistics and bringing us all together to have this discussion this afternoon. And so I look forward to working with you as we go forward in the months ahead. Thank you again and have a very pleasant evening. Thanks.